Hello, everybody, and welcome to our weekly webinar from Squibbler. This week, we're going to talk to you about show, don't tell, and this is limiting unnecessary exposition in your book or script. In this webinar, you're going to learn what exposition is and how to use it, genres that are going to limit exposition and why they limit it. And then you'll learn some tips for making sure your writing is showing and not telling. So what is exposition? Maybe a while since you were in high school and you forgot the term. In fiction or in screenplay writing and even in nonfiction, exposition is the technique used to introduce background information that's essential for understanding the story or narrative. This is going to include details about the setting, character histories, plot context, relevant themes, any kind of historical information that you want to include that your readers are going to need to have. So in a story or screenplay, exposition should be woven in subtly. This is going to allow readers to understand the world, relationships, and motivations without disrupting the narrative flow. Effective exposition is going to enrich your story by providing context naturally, and this is often through dialogue, though not always, narration, or character thoughts. So readers are going to become immersed in the story's universe without feeling overwhelmed by explanations. So I thought we'd start with an example of good exposition from The Silence of the Lambs by Thomas Harris. And this is also in the screenplay as well, when Hannibal Lecter and Clarice first meet while he's in the prison cell. And he cuts her off and he says, "Turns. If I help you, Clarice, it will be turns with us too. Quid pro quo. I tell you things, you tell me things. Not about this case, though, about yourself. Quid pro quo. Yes or no? Yes or no, Clarice? Poor little Catherine is waiting." Clarice says, "Go, doctor." And from there, they're going to go back and forth where Hannibal is going to be interested in things about Clarice and her upbringing, and Clarice is trying to get information from him about the serial killer who has kidnapped Catherine. So how do you use exposition? It's extremely difficult to conduct research for your novel or script, only to have to condense it for some more interesting elements so you don't bore your reader. After all, readers want to get to the meat of your tale or your narrative. If they wanted to read a book, for example, on Victorian barbers, they would head to the nonfiction section of the library. If they want fiction on this topic, they're much more interested in what Sweeney Todd is going to do to his victims and how all the characters will respond to these murderous attempts than they are the act of barbary in the 19th century. So we'll take a look at a terrible example here. This one says, Detective Miller was a seasoned cop with 20 years on the force, having worked his way up from a beat officer in the rough neighborhood Chicago. He had seen it all: murders, robberies, gang violence, the kind of cases that hardened him over time. His wife had left him 5 years ago, tired of the long hours and dangers of his job, and he rarely saw his 2 kids anymore. He lived alone in a small, dimly lit apartment filled with stacks of unsorted case files and empty beer bottles. He wore a worn leather jacket every day, the same one he'd had since his academy days, and carried his father's old revolver, a Colt Python, which he'd inherited. He preferred whiskey to coffee and had a distrust of politicians and big corporations. All of this weighed down on his mind as he stared at the crime scene in front of him, wondering where it had all gone wrong. If you made it through reading this, I would be surprised if you had a book, because I would probably stop reading after this paragraph. It's just a lot to try to absorb, and it's running through details about this character very, very quickly. So here's a good way to rewrite something like that. Here you're going to see 2 characters talk about Detective Miller. "Can you believe Detective Miller is still using that old Colt Python?" Detective Jones shook his head while watching Miller examine the scene. "I swear that gun's as ancient as he is." Detective Harris chuckled. "Yeah, and he's had that leather jacket since his academy days. You'd think he'd bought himself a new one by now." "I guess not much has changed for him since his wife walked out," Jones replied, his voice lowering. "What, 5 years ago? Yeah, I heard he hardly sees his kids either." So in this case, we're getting some dialogue that makes the scene more interesting, and we're getting some exposition on this character, but it's not being detailed for us in a long, boring paragraph. So here's another example of a boring exposition, and then we'll see how a professional writer is going to change something like this. Lorenzo di Rossi was a renowned painter in Florence, the heart of the Italian Renaissance, a time when art, science, and philosophy flourished across Europe. Born in 1453, the same year Constantinople fell, he had grown up surrounded by the works of masters like Donatello, Brunelleschi, and Fra Angelico, each influencing his craft. He was well versed in perspective techniques, which had revolutionized painting and given depth to otherwise flat canvases, and his use of canvas was inspired by the vibrant frescoes adorning the chapels and cathedrals of Florence. The son of a wealthy silk merchant, Lorenzo had trained under Verruccio, and even though he was highly sought after by patrons from all over Italy, he was secretly unsatisfied with his art. I was bored reading that, so I'm sure you were bored listening to it. Let's take a look how someone like Umberto Eco, the famous Italian writer of The Name of the Rose, is going to have a character begin his narrative in his book Bardolino. So this is a similar historical fiction setting, but you're much more engrossed in what Baldolino is going to say versus what we just took a look at. This is where Baldolino takes a hand at his writing, and he has some Latin thrown in here, but he has made up the Latin. It's not accurate. I, Baldolino, son of Giaglido of the Alluri, with the head that looks like a lion, alleluia, gratias to the Almighty, may he forgive me. Uh, ego habeo facto, the greatest stealing of my life. I mean, from the cabinet of the Bishop Otto, I have stolen many pages that may belong to the imperial chancellor, and I have scraped clean almost all of them, excepting where the writing would not come off. And now I have much parchment to write down what I want, which is my own story, even if I don't know how to write Latin. So we know a lot about Bartolino just in this small paragraph, this small writing passage here. We know that he cannot write well. We know that he's making up the Latin, which is pretty humorous. We know that he has stolen some vellum from the bishop and he's scraped off the writing that's already on there so he can reuse it. So instead of being told that he's illiterate or mostly illiterate, that his narrative is questionable, Umberto Eco here is showing this to us instead of explaining that Baldolino may be an untrustworthy narrator. So some things about genre and exposition. If you're working or you've read several genres, you might notice that exposition is going to be limited in some of these. And those genres are usually horror, crime, action, and thriller. All of these genres rely on tension and tight pacing to keep viewers and readers engrossed in their narratives. This doesn't mean that you get a pass if you're writing, say, fantasy or historical fiction, where you do need to give some more background about your book. Or your screenplay. Your readers will expect some exposition on how magic works in your universe. It has to be credible. Or if you're writing about killers in Victorian England, your readers will expect to know some of police procedure back then. You can't get pulled out of that era with DNA, for example, in the Victorian era. It has to make sense. But the key is going to be how you're going to incorporate facts that readers need versus the ones that you just want to include. And in my own writing, I will admit that I was obsessed with the medieval era when I was in my early 20s. I wrote a huge book, and I did so much research that I thought it was important to show off how much I had read, how much research I had done. And that book is really unreadable at this point because it just has too much exposition in it and not enough interesting things to keep readers interested in it. You'll often find that some writers limit their exposition intentionally to create a sense of unease or confusion. For example, the famous American writer Cormac McCarthy never explicitly tells his readers what happened to cause the devastation in the road. We know it was from volcanic ash, but we don't know if the disaster is a geographically limited one. We only get small snippets of information. So you really, really get a heightened sense of unease by what's not being told to us. So that's something to consider as well. Other genres, such as those in nonfiction, will obviously demand more exposition. This is a typical reader expectation. Memoirs, however, are still going to benefit from vivid descriptive writing and dialogue that limits exposition. So if you're writing a memoir, it's important to make sure that you're including things that are not just exposition there. Self-help and educational books, of course, are going to include more exposition. We expect those when we are reading those kinds of genres. One tip for looking at how much exposition to include in your own writing is to read a current best-selling book or script in the same genre that you're writing. And you can do this by looking up, top-selling memoirs from 2024, 2023. You can look up top fantasy novels from the year. And then you can see how these authors are using exposition in their own successful writing. You want to look to see how the writer is handling areas of exposition. How much are they including? How much background detail? How much are they handling research and details? And just as important, what are they choosing to exclude? So here are some tips for you. One is for showing and not telling. One is to use flashbacks. You can introduce important details gradually through memories and not up front. And this is done to a really interesting degree in the film Memento, where the plot is going to unfold in reverse, revealing key details only as the protagonist himself uncovers them. So we're along for that journey with him. As he's discovering things in this movie, we're discovering them as well. This is often the case in crime and thriller movies. We learn about the conflict and mystery alongside the protagonist. So we're there for the ride with the protagonist. Another tip is to begin in media res. In media res means in the middle. So you're going to start the story in the middle of the action with a little background given. Star Wars: A New Hope opens with a battle in space, giving a little explanation before the plot moves forward. We do get a screen crawl at the beginning, giving us a little bit of background, but it's not going to be a large part of the screenplay itself. But the world is going to be slowly unfurled before our eyes in Star Wars. We'll learn things as our characters are going through their journey. Another way to develop showing and not telling and limiting your exposition is to use a nonlinear structure. You might want to reveal information out of sequence, out of order, to maintain that sense of mystery. The Prestige is one of my favorite movies. And in books, it unfolds through a series of nonlinear flashbacks, and it's going to reveal things slowly, keeping the audience guessing. This is a great way to build tension and suspense. So I recommend it if you're writing thrillers or crime. Another tip for limiting your exposition is character perspective. You want to limit information to what the character knows or perceives. In The Catcher in the Rye, which is narrated by a teenager, Holden Caulfield, we only learn what Holden chooses to reveal to us. This strategy that the author J.D. Salinger uses is especially successful because we cannot be sure that Holden is ever being completely honest with us. We don't know if he's telling the truth in many situations. He's more interested in making himself look like the hero of his story. So that's something that you might consider as well. Another tip is for limiting your exposition, and this is for our fantasy and science fiction writers. You want to have your world building develop through action. Show the world through the character experiences rather than explaining it. So in something like The Matrix, the worlds are revealed as Neo learns them. The writers here are avoiding lengthy exposition and dialogue. Neo does get some guidance from Morpheus, but a lot of what we experience along with Neo is what you would say is on-the-job training. He's going to have to experiment with, these limitations of the AI world taken away from him. And sometimes it can be very dangerous. And you can also look at popular works in the genre. When you look at something like J.K. Rowling's Harry Potter series, that world is slowly revealed to us through the eyes of Harry Potter. So we follow him as he leaves the world of non-humans, the Muggles, to the world of the magic in Hogwarts. Another tip for limiting your exposition is to make sure you keep your mysteries alive. You don't want to reveal all your secrets at once. And some novel and screenplay tension comes from not knowing the full truth until much later, almost at the end of the work itself. For example, in Gillian Flynn's Gone Girl, much of the story's tension is going to come from not knowing the full truth until later. And it's a shocking result when we get to the end of the book or the film. Another tip is to cut unnecessary scenes. You want to remove any scene or line that solely exists to explain something. A writer who does that very well is Cormac McCarthy. In No Country for Old Men, much of the tension that McCarthy is able to develop comes from us not fully understanding the motivations behind Chiguro's actions, the villain's actions. And we kind of have to interpret what his motivations are. And ultimately, it's pretty unresolved, and it makes it much more unsettling for us. Another tip is to work with subtext. You want to convey meaning indirectly through what's unsaid. In The Great Gatsby, for example, by F. Scott Fitzgerald, Gatsby's wealth and mystery are shown through his extravagant parties and not explained directly. There's a lot of talking about Gatsby, but again, we don't know how much of it is valuable, how much of it is reliable. So we learn a lot about him as well by what remains unsaid. When it comes to dialogue, you do need to be careful there too. Just including dialogue is not enough to ensure that you're not including exposition. You want to let conversations reveal character and context without over explaining. For example, a character shouldn't say something like, I'm angry. We should be able to infer it by their actions and their choice of words. Actors can, of course, make this happen on film. It's a little bit more difficult for those of us who are writing. We have to find ways to incorporate this. I'm thinking about an interview I saw with David Baldacci, the thriller writer, and he said that he likes to limit exposition by having characters talk to one another, where one will ask a question if it's something that the reader needs to know, and then someone else will respond. And I've always thought that was a really clever way of handling exposition. Another, of course, the biggest one that you hear all the time is show and don't tell. So you want to reveal details through actions and through dialogue. And something like The Godfather, instead of explaining Michael's inner conflicts, we see his actions, like his reluctant involvement in the family business. We can tell he doesn't really want to be part of the mafia empire. You can also use Squibbler's show and don't tell rewrite function, and with rewrite and then you can pull down the menu to do the show don't tell revision of your own work. So now we've come almost to the end of our webinar. And if you're interested in trying this, you can try to rewrite the passage on the next slide. And I guarantee it's terrible because it has way too much exposition. So you might try limiting the exposition in it. We'd love to see your revisions in the comments here. You can use rewrite and show, not tell if you want to use AI, or you can use your own revision in the comments if you'd like to. So this would be a good point to pause and read this terrible long paragraph about Detective Sam Harlow living in New York City. See what you can eliminate. See what you can maybe turn into dialogue with characters talking, but because it's just got way too much exposition, and this would bore your reader if they were reading it. So in this webinar, we have reviewed what exposition is and how to use it, why it is valuable. We've looked at genres that limit exposition and why these genres limit it. And we looked at some tips for making sure your own writing is showing and not telling. Thank you for joining us once again. We always love to have you here with us, and we hope to see you next week. Bye, everybody.